Hey, welcome back to another Bitcoin Reformation podcast. I'm Ben Haupt, joined with my friend David Rufner and a guest that we have with you today to share a little bit about Bitcoin and a ministry, a Christian ministry, pastor that's going to tell us a little bit about that. So great to be with you. I'm going to pass the mic to David.
Hello, all. So prior to moving to Southern California to work for the ministry I work for, I lived in Michigan and served two different churches over the course of 16 years. First church actually was not so far from you, down in Flushing, about a half an hour from where our guest, Ed Doerner, lives and is a pastor, does ministry. And I think you've been there some time. We're going to give that to you here real shortly. About 6, 7, 8 years ago, when I was in the Grand Rapids area, I was encouraged by our district president to go with a group of guys and head up to Messiah Bullock Creek and see what Ed was up to. Some very... I don't know what the right descriptor is. I'm sure it's been called innovative ministry. I'm sure all the descriptors have been added to it, but no division between loving the gospel, proclaiming the gospel, and loving and caring for your community with this gentleman. That's what I'll at least say about you and the church and all those who serve with you. And so with that, this is Pastor Ed Doerner. We're all three together. I happened to be in Phoenix together for this best practices ministry. Heard that Ed was going to be here. Heard that Ed might be a little bit into Bitcoin, and that descriptor was wrong. Ed's not a little bit into Bitcoin.
A lot into Bitcoin.
He's a lot into Bitcoin. And so all that to say, you have a pastor, husband, father, man who loves his community and church, knows of God's love for him in Christ and wants all others to hear about that. And he's a Bitcoin maxi. And so we have found a friend here. And although I will say this, with the hundreds of other people out there, I'm like, are there any more, Lord? Are there any more? Anyways, maybe not.
Not yet. Yeah.
So we had heard of Ed interested in using Bitcoin for one ministry activity. And that had to do with, and we'll let him talk about that, sending mission dollars into the mission field. It's hard if you've done it. In many places of the world, it's a hard thing to do. It's hard. It's slow. There's a lot of slippage in what you send versus the value that arrives. There's all these things. So we'd heard about that. But I think the conversation you're about ready to hear is a bit bigger than that. And without that, and hopefully not having put any two strictures on the conversation, I'm going to hand this microphone over to you, Ed, and have you lead us. Take it away.
Well, how about you give me a question?
A question. So I first want to hear about life and ministry. So family and ministry. And then from there, we'll actually then give you questions more specifically into Bitcoin.
Got it. Well, life and ministry. I mean, I'm married, 4 kids, all adult, 3 grandkids. Ministry has really been going amazing. I've been here almost 17 years at Messiah in Midland. And we have a heart and passion for the community. So we found out, people need car repair. So now we have an automotive garage. People struggle to put food on the table. We have a grocery store. People struggling with job creation or just getting jobs through barriers. So we started a job creation ministry, appliance repair, refurbishing, now roofing, ramps. We found there was a need for healthcare, affordable healthcare. We opened up a healthcare clinic, with a medical director, medical doctor, 2 nurse practitioners, nurse, 2 medical assistants. We have an early care and education. We're in housing. The housing's amazing just because when we move a person into the house, we charge 30% of what they make, and then we rebate 90% of what they're doing. So we're investing heavily, and I know this is kind of where we're going. We invest heavily in assets, and I think that woke up in me, and I was like, wow, this is incredible. We should keep investing in more assets that are going to be producing a greater return. So now we're on track in a multi-million-dollar purchase. I mean, this week we're working on it. We have the first of one house. By the end of the year, we should have 5 more houses that we're purchasing. So we're being very strategic in what we're doing so that we can do the greatest amount of ministry and get the most amount of assets that are related to what we're doing in ministry. And Bitcoin is one of those options.
Love it. So we're always interested in with our guests to find out how'd you get into Bitcoin in the first place. David and I and our co-host who is usually with us but not with us today, Jared Townley. He is on the back end doing some editing for us, probably for this episode. But David, Jared, and I have all shared how we each got into Bitcoin, and I think every story is unique and different for how an individual really decides finally, okay, I'm going to kind of dip my toe into it. And then you usually get into it a little bit, and then you realize, whoa, I'm really intrigued by this, and it's really different, and I think I'll get into it a lot more. So tell us your story of how you got into Bitcoin.
Well, my son is a financial planner, and he just called me one day and he's like, Dad, you got to look into this. This is pretty incredible. And he didn't do anything with it yet. He was learning about it. So I just went on a journey. Michael Saylor, I started listening to him. I probably realistically, I had 400 hours before I invested anything. I mean, I'm well over 1,000 hours. I mean, even today I was listening to a podcast, about Bitcoin, because what I appreciate about Bitcoin is that it's nothing the world has ever seen before. And it is a different mindset. It is outside of our current system. I mean, I'm not saying anything your listeners don't already know, but you really have to get your arms around this. And I think the hardest thing for people to do is to realize it's a different system. And I think sometimes we're struggling to, how do I do fiat currency, but also do Bitcoin? And I think we're combining, oil and water. They really do not mix. You use the fiat to get into the Bitcoin, but you hold the Bitcoin. And then if you're ever going to go back into the fiat or use Bitcoin for the fiat, you want to leverage it by borrowing against it, never using the asset, grab the asset, hold the asset. And I heard something last week that really, really impacted me about Bitcoin. And sometimes you hear something like, I can't forget that. If every millionaire in America wanted to own a Bitcoin, they can't. And I'm like, thank you, Lord, that my son got me into Bitcoin. I grabbed some Bitcoin. I actually borrowed a lot of money and bought Bitcoin. Okay. That's what I did.
That's conviction.
And my son was like, okay, Dad, people think you're insane that you did this, that you borrowed all this money to get in Bitcoin. And you know what? Actually, in the short amount of time that I did that, it's gone up so much in value that it's just like, it's almost laughable, because if I ever want to take the money out, it's already paid for. So I'm like, whoa, this is incredible. So it's kind of fun.
That is tremendous. So to say you listen to Saylor quite a bit makes me think I maybe know when about you were doing that initial investigation. I wish I was prior to Saylor, but I wish I had listened to Saylor and maybe invested in MicroStrategy a bit. But anyways, that's another story for another time. I'm actually impressed to hear that a son who's a financial planner was open enough to it, because, the old adage, show me the incentives, I'll show you the outcome. It's been suggested that Bitcoin could be a challenge to folks like your son as a financial planner someday, because what's there left to plan? You just, you get it, you hold it, and you be patient, right? And you have your mindset change for a lot of things in the world around you, which I'm hearing you say even before we hit record. I'm hearing you say now in the recording. And Ben and I were the same thing. We were at dinner last night, and he said Bitcoin has changed his mindset for ministry in many ways. Okay, so having said all that, your son gets you into Bitcoin. How and you did? I think you began to make that bridge with the assets and your ministry, the amazing amount of ministry that you do. I'm like, you might get more done by like 5:30 a.m. every day than I do in a week, is how I'm feeling right now. But anyways, how though does Bitcoin and this ministry more fully intersect for you? Because it seems it's on a collision course. It seems you're headed there.
Well, I don't know if it's a collision course. Actually, we're investing, like I said, in assets where I'm going to be really encouraging the board is take some of the revenue from these assets to purchase other assets. I mean, I think the church has to think differently, because if they're using an old model of save $1 million and then use, 4% of it for your ministry, I'm not seeing fruit of that outcome that I see today that say, okay, that's revolutionary. That's really changing churches. And that's really fueling churches to move forward. What we're doing, I see it fueling forward. I really think from this next purchase that we're looking at, that I was telling you about, that we're scaling what we're doing, it should free up realistically $500,000 of new money annually.
Wow.
That we are borrowing the money, but we're freeing up dollars. And so that now we can start this acceleration process. And then if we can take some of those assets, I'm going to go back to the board and say, let's be really smart. Let's take a portion of these assets, buy Bitcoin, hold it on a balance sheet, because that way it gives more options. Let's just say in 5 years, like the building we're purchasing now, it's going to be an interest-only loan. But if we take some of the revenue from this business that we're starting in there for auto parts, and then we invest that money, in 10 years from now, when we say to the lender, okay, we're ready to pay you back, we'll probably just borrow against the Bitcoin, pay the lender back. We still have the Bitcoin and let the Bitcoin just pay for the loan. So we're trying to think outside the box, and how do we fund ministry for decades to come, so that we can move it forward. Just a different way of thinking.
It's so fascinating. I mean, in a lot of ways, I've actually been on the hunt for kind of a Michael Saylor type, who is ready to think really out of the box and leverage what Bitcoin is, but specifically for ministry, and not just for, whatever micro-strategy or strategy is going to become. Recently, it's been suggested that maybe Saylor's angling toward creating a Bitcoin bank of some sort, and that strategy B is going to be strategy bank at some point. We'll see. Who knows? But what I'm starting to sense is that we've kind of found a Michael Saylor in ministry, and it's really, really exciting to hear how you're thinking about funding ministry, and that even this endowment model is an outmoded idea, and we're ready for new approaches. I'm interested, you mentioned a little bit about the board, and I know from our conversation before we started recording that this is a conversation that you've already had. We have had an episode where we encouraged viewers to talk with their board, to talk with ministries about Bitcoin. I'm interested in what that initial conversation is like, how you went about it, and how the conversation over time has kind of progressed or evolved as people began to be more and more open from the board perspective. I mean, being on a board is a fiduciary responsibility, and we don't jump into flashy things. And Bitcoin has, for a lot of time, had this sort of reputation for being kind of gunslinger, Wild West kind of thing. So how do you talk to a board who takes seriously their fiduciary responsibility that this isn't wild and crazy stuff? This is the best thing that they could do?
I think it's a really good question. When I approached it with the board, actually was probably the most challenging meeting I've ever had with the board in 17 years.
Wow.
And it's really okay, because I think I really learned where they were. A couple of years earlier, I asked the church, would you like to invest in the future of the church? And so some money was raised, and I was at the board meeting, and I just said, I would like to take those dollars and invest in Bitcoin. At the time, I think it was trading for about, 43,000 or so. And they said, we believe factually it's going to drop down to about 9 or 10. It's really not worth. And there was some truth there. It went down to 16.
Mm-hmm.
So we didn't invest it. They weren't ready to invest it. And I'm not so sure the church is ready to invest the dollars that have been given into something like Bitcoin that they really didn't understand. And none of them had any hours. And by that time I had a couple hundred hours into it. So I was ready to go. And they were just blown away by, we don't even understand this, so you're taking our money and maybe gambling it. They really didn't understand it. So here's how I work with the board. If I can produce something, another revenue source, which is what we're on track to do, and then take some of those proceeds, now I feel like I can go back to the board and say, okay, I have new money. We have new money that we didn't anticipate. Now we can either just consume those dollars, or why don't we just keep investing? And this would be a great investment. So it's a mind shift for the church. The church is, I know I'm an innovator. They will eventually see this, but I don't know if all of them will ever adopt. I have already. This is a no-brainer for me. So we'll see how it goes in the future. I'll work with them. But I think the key is, how does the church today invest in assets that are revenue producing? And I think the difference for like a building, you buy a building and at some time you sell it, but what do you do with Bitcoin where you buy it and you hold it? And then how do you maximize the proceeds from the Bitcoin? It's a radically different way of thinking that I find in all the people I talk to. Church, out of church, everywhere, everybody's struggling to just comprehend what it is.
For sure.
Yeah. So I just think we're just a little bit further along, and I can't wait to see, because I think there's a window, and the window has not passed, but I think the window is passing, where, you bought Bitcoin for significantly lower, which I'm so jealous about. I'm like, Lord, if only I would have known, because I know even the revenue that it would have produced. My goodness, you could change ministry forever.
Yeah.
And so opportunities were lost, but there's still opportunities to gain. And I think it's only going to continue to go, because the whole world is just starting to catch on to this.
I'll ask a follow-up question. I was really fascinated to hear you talk about Bitcoin as a revenue-producing asset. Warren Buffett, famous investor, he was very convinced that people should invest in revenue-producing assets. And I think his argument, at least as far as what I've heard in the past, is that, well, A, he didn't understand Bitcoin, but B, he didn't think that it was a revenue-producing asset. He called it rat poison squared. So I'm interested in hearing you make the argument for why Bitcoin is a revenue-producing asset.
When I say it's revenue producing, I'm also a fan that you buy it and you hold it. So I think the new model is you leverage it in the future. That's the revenue producing. If there's a mistake that I'm learning, that we view Bitcoin, we keep comparing it to the US dollar, but every country in the world is comparing it to their own currency. See, and I think even for me, learning this, it is so far outside the system that I think we're trying to get our arms around Bitcoin that is outside of a system that the world has never known, doesn't even know how to get its arm around. But how can we leverage it in such a way that we can enter or bring some of that asset back into fiat currency, or back into a property that continues to produce more assets or more revenue? I think this is where it's like innovation thinking. But so when I say revenue producing, it can't be revenue producing if you're only holding it. But we got to figure out how to actually leverage it in order to purchase more assets that will then produce more revenue.
Yep.
So that ministry, I believe in a multiplication of dollars. I mean, I shared with you a little while ago that our church tithes about $150,000, but we're doing about $6 million of ministry annually. We multiply dollars. I think Bitcoin is really going to be like a multiplier on steroids. Wow. That's what I see coming.
Yeah, I love it. I love even the example you gave of imagine somebody giving such a generous gift as $1 million to a church with the hope that it is invested in some sort of safe but growing vehicle. And you gave the number of 4%.
Mm-hmm.
Even at 4%, it's not even fully treading water with the inflation that's taking place with fiat, and doesn't appear that it will cease anytime soon. I mean, the Fed targets 2%. We've been far from 2% now for some time. And if you're paying attention to the sovereign debt crisis that we have in fiat, and so many nations do have, I think inflation is persistent. So go back to it. An amazing $1 million gift given to a ministry. And we've accepted as good, possibly even called wonderful, 4% a year. A lot of dollars are being tied up, and the value of those dollars that are coming out of it is honestly being eaten up by inflation over time. We've conceded, but it's a concession that we've become comfortable with, very comfortable with. Mm-hmm. We've been so inside the system for so long that we can't see anything else. I know for Ben and I'm catching it with you, Ed, we talk about how we've become hopeful for the continued care of the people in our lives. That's from our wives to our children, and we've begun talking conversations about neighbors. And if I'm right, that's another way to look at all that you're talking about, is this is a very hopeful path forward. It's a flywheel that keeps gaining strength in your ability to not only steward what you have, but not steward it to the bottom, steward it and see it continue to go places. Can Can you speak to hope? Has it changed? I mean, you've always known of the resurrection of Christ for you and others, and you proclaim this and his presence with us now and his gifts. And yet I'm curious, both from maybe a philosophical perspective, but then theological as well. What does Bitcoin then mean? Not just for the ministry, but as you think of ongoing ministry, and now in this case, I'm not talking about the auto shop, but I'm talking about the people you serve through the auto shop. I'm not talking about the grocery store, but your actual neighbors there that you serve. How would you frame Bitcoin in that language of hope? And if not hope, how else might you frame it?
Well, the hope we have is in Christ always, but that's the hope that we want for everybody. And if we're going to have that hope for everybody, then the church needs to be involved in community ministry. And I think it is really the hope of the church, because I think churches are in rapid decline. I just went through session. Churches are in rapid decline. We're not in rapid decline at all. In fact, we're the opposite. I mean, we've actually doubled in the last few years.
Wow.
Our baptisms continue to go up significantly. The impact that we're having in the community. I mean, when you talk about people, our automotive garage every day has between 150 to 200 contacts with people. So think about the impact of one of those ministries. So if we're going to sustain that ministry and give hope to people who are hurting, can't afford car repair, come to us, their cars are condemned because they're unsafe, they're not worth fixing. We can't give enough. We charge them, but we charge them what they can afford. So it's a ministry that's going to need some dollars along the way in order to sustain the ministry. So really, I think this is what Bitcoin is. I'm looking at it as, if we can invest in this and actually leverage it for more assets, then we can make sure that this ministry will continue for decades to come without always spending time trying to do the fundraising. So if I give you maybe a little example so that you know where I'm coming from, why I think Bitcoin fits with.
And by the way, you're
Yes.
talking to two professional fundraisers.
Yeah. Oh,
so we're
all right.
actually sympathetic to
Oh,
this.
yes. Yeah, very
Because
much
we
so.
see what fundraising has been,
Yeah.
and even this conversation comes to us and says,
Mhm.
this is the future of fundraising. So I'm sorry,
Yeah.
I didn't mean to fully interrupt you, but please go. Yeah.
No, we're actually right on the brink of never having to fundraise again for these ministries, ever again. We're actually creating a funding ministry. And we woke up to this. We always try things small and then we scale. So like we bought a building, we have 2 renters, and then we have the Bridge Food Center. So they just moved into a beautiful 16,000 square foot facility. I mean, it looks like every grocery store, but we charge a nickel over what our cost is. So a nickel over wholesale. It's all volunteer run. The whole community runs it. Corporations come in, schools come in, students come in, community service, banks, they're all running it. But by buying the building, we used an asset to pay the mortgage and then actually pay for all the expenses that the grocery store has. And that kind of woke up something in me. And I'm like, okay, this is kind of cool. Then I went to investors and said, if you give me $1,000, we can turn it into $100,000. I mean, and they were like, you can't do that. All right, but let me show you how we're doing it. So when you gave us $1,000, which donors did. In fact, donors gave us $60,000, and we bought $60,000 of food. Well, when you sell the food at a nickel over cost, if I sell $1,000 of food, how much money do I have in my pocket? $60,000. So I bought it again, and I bought it again. Now let me contrast this. We used to do food giveaways. So you'd raise the money, and then you would buy the food, 2 semi-loads, give it away. Okay, now you want to do this again. You got to raise the money for 2 more truckloads. So you're raising money and then it gets consumed. Raising money gets consumed, right? But when you change your thinking and you do this with food, with a grocery store, plus it's dignity. Dignity is everything for us, and affordability. So we've taken $60,000 over the last 8.5 years and we've used it 54 times. So we've turned every $1,000 given into $54,000. Every 1,000 times 60. You do the math. 60 times, or 54 times 60,000. You're over $3 million from an initial investment of 60,000. So I know for some people that's like, okay, I can't get my arms around that. Well, that woke up in us. What else can we multiply? And all of our ministries for the nonprofit, because we have the church, and then we have Elevate, which is a nonprofit, and we also have Gateway Healthcare, which is a nonprofit. We did that one for liability against the church. And now we're looking at all of them. What can we do to multiply the dollars? Now, you talk hope. When you multiply the dollars, now we can help more people get the healing that they need. When you multiply dollars, they can put food on the table. In our community, when you talk hope, I think we may be one of the only communities that nobody in our community will ever have to choose between medical care or food. Never again. Because we don't charge any more than $40 at our healthcare. And if you need hospitalization, we take you through the financial aid department of the hospital, and we send over 1,000 people there. And they get full care, cancer treatments, chemotherapy, radiation, all covered. So for a $40 investment of a person, they get all the healthcare they need. They're getting the best healthcare. So now we're looking at, all right, we need funding, we need multiplication funds to go on so that we can give hope to that one person who comes into the health clinic and has no other resources. And sometimes they scramble, like we had a person 2 weeks ago. We said, how much can you put towards this? They walked out to the car. They got 35 cents. And they came in and said, this is all the money I have. And one of our medical assistants added 65 cents to it to come up with $1. They gave this person a gift card to the grocery store. So now they had medical care for 35 cents, unlimited medical care, and they got food. So see, we're even multiplying healing because food is also our healer. You know, God is the healer, but he uses food and he uses medicine. So here for 35 cents, we multiply this person's healing. So I think if there's a message, and this is where Bitcoin comes in and hope, it's multiplication process. See, if you guys are in a fundraising, you should be spending all of your energy in multiplication of assets. And Bitcoin is one of those avenues, but it can't be the only one. There's a lot of other avenues you can use.
Good. So my mind is being blown right now. I feel like I'm being orange pilled all over again, a phrase that we use in the Bitcoin community to talk about mind being blown and yeah, just amazing stuff. I'm interested maybe to close out, if you had some advice that you would give to our listeners. I think some of them are into Bitcoin and they listen to us because of that. But I think a lot of our listeners are sort of Bitcoin curious and maybe not quite ready to pull the trigger. We talked to a good friend last night who has listened to some episodes and is close. But what advice would you give to somebody that's Bitcoin curious, that's heard a little bit about it, but there's been all kinds of things that have kind of held them back from just diving in? So just some advice directly to our listeners about Bitcoin.
Well, I think the advice that I would give would be start doing your homework immediately and listen to everything you can get. Just get on YouTube, listen to Michael Saylor. He's the genius. But when you bet your whole company and all of your personal assets on this, he's got a lot to lose.
Yeah.
And so I kind of found for myself, I'm going to follow in his way, which is why I borrowed money in order to get Bitcoin. Because if he's betting everything on this and it's turned out well. So every listener, I would say, as quickly as they're able to comprehend it, start learning as much as they can. And don't be afraid to start investing, and just invest every week or every other week, whatever they do, every paycheck, start investing in it. Because very quickly, it's going to come to a place that everybody's going to wish they knew this earlier. I mean, that's where I am with you. Man, I wish I knew it earlier, but I didn't. But I know it now. But at least I did what I can now to help safeguard actually future generations.
That's right.
So learn everything you can learn. Don't be bashful to start investing, because the longer that it goes on, the more people are going to learn. The more that they learn, the more that they're going to say, boy, I'm so glad I did this. And I think everybody's going to have one regret. I wish I would have done more earlier.
I'm going to go ahead and ask one more question. We actually haven't talked about the topic that we heard about with you. That first was that email. Ed, David Rufner, we've met before. just heard. And so the question is, mission field somewhere.
Yeah.
You're part of a group of folks with a mission focus for the gospel in a particular nation. I'll let you say that. And if you can just bring us up to speed, what's the level of conversation in terms of sending, I'm going to call it value. We typically would say dollars, but in this case, we're actually talking value, resources, purchasing power to support ministry there. What's the level of conversation of using Bitcoin for that?
So I went to South Africa last March, and our kids did an amazing thing. We have a camp, like a vacation Bible school, and we raised about $500 so that the kids in this, it's not an orphanage, but it's kids who've been removed from their homes. It's called Middelburg in South Africa, our care village. Amazing ministry down there. So I went down there, saw it, learned about it. We came back, did a VBS, raised, $500, and I wanted to send it. Well, I didn't realize how hard it was going to be to send $500. And it cost us $100 in fees. So we spent $100 in fees to send it there. And we say in communication every other week, we talk on the phone. And I said, you need a Bitcoin account. We actually, as a church, we're getting a Bitcoin account. We got denied because I didn't know what know your customer meant. KYC. They kept saying, you're not answering KYC. And I said, I don't even know what that is. And so they're like, denied, but now I know. So we're actually going to do it again. We're going to go ahead and get an exchange account probably with Coinbase. But then I told Andre down in South Africa, you get it. And then I can just send it to you like instantly. And it's for pennies, and actually, just last week, our accountant came up and said, okay, we got $97 for South Africa. How are we going to get it to them?
With $100 fee.
With $100 fee. So we paid the fees to send the money because we wanted them to have an ice cream, social for it. And so we're going to go ahead and get an exchange, get the Bitcoin, transfer it in there, and then send it off. And I think it's going to be one of the best things for missions, because now when you send it over to them, they can watch their exchange rate and they're going to be able to cash out in a way that's going to benefit them to the best, of their ability. So I think on both sides.
Absolutely.
Just a phenomenal way for mission money.
Yep. So I'll go ahead and just add a little bit more to that. Typically, those have been called remittance payments. The maybe more typical scenario is an individual grows up in a country, moves to the States, and I'll just make it self-referential, moves to the States, works for enough money to send money back home to siblings, to mom and dad, to extended family, remittance payments. And the slippage on this it's been widely known. Like if you were to use Western Union in the past, you're talking 12 to 20% fees.
Right.
It's typically tied up for 1 to 2 weeks. There's a slippage of time there. And there's been stories of, grandma and grandpa getting on the bus, going 2 hours in to the city, and they go to Western Union to get the cash. And there's been all the slippage thus far. Now they have to pay the mafiosos their cut once they have cash in the local currency in hand. Bitcoin is a beautiful technology for human care in this way, for remittance payments family to family. And it had been on my mind, ministry. I'd helped send money into Haiti years ago through a church I served, and it was awful to see this process. Absolutely awful. Felt mysterious. You're wondering, is it landing on the other end? All these questions. And now the ability, as you said, to be able to do it instantly. And you can do a variety of things. You could actually just send a Bitcoin. There's networks. I think of Strike with the CEO, Jack Mallers, being there. You could start in US dollars and send it over the Bitcoin network, but it lands actually in their wallet in local currency as well. There's choices that can be made, but it happens very quickly, happens very privately, safely, and without the fees. My goodness, $100 fees and a $500 gift. And good on the church. I can see many churches choosing to do that. We will eat the fee. They're going to get the full, but why eat the fee if we don't have to eat the fee and we can have all these other upsides? So our capital H hope is Christ for the world.
Always.
If we can offer, there are the lowercase hope things that we're hopeful for, hopeful for our kids, our communities and the like. And that's what we would want our hearers to hear, every few weeks when we get one of these podcasts out. And I think we're all in agreement there. We see it very hopeful to human flourishing and human care, this Bitcoin technology. And so, Ed, I thank you, and I'm going to hand it over to Ben and let him close it out unless you have other further words as well.
This has been so good. What came to my mind, I spoke a couple days ago at a conference, and I encouraged people to think network, not hierarchy. And Bitcoin definitely is a part of this network kind of thinking. And this book, Leading Through, that just came out from Harvard Business Review, talks about this new paradigm for leadership, which when you're thinking network, you begin to be more confident in taking risks. And I've heard a lot of that in your thinking, this confidence in taking risks. But as Christians, we know that ultimately the reason why we are so confident and why we can take risks and try new things and explore new pathways is because of our confidence in Christ and the hope that we have in Him. So listeners, be blessed. Keep up the great work. Keep studying Bitcoin, and we'll be back with you for another episode. And Ed, I'd love to have you on again to hear how this is all progressing and what you're learning. I think we found somebody that we need to be paying attention to in the Bitcoin and ministry space. So God bless, and we'll see you next time.